The Hoop Heads Podcast is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
There can be so much more joy in the process, and these players can not only know that they're going out there to achieve this goal of winning, but they're doing it with someone that they love very much while they're in the process of doing it.
Patrick Touhey is the author of the new book, Create Forever Teammates. He is president at Elite Performance Touhey, LLC. Patrick was also a high school basketball head coach for both boys and girls teams, as well as a college assistant coach. When his brother, Hall of Fame basketball coach Kevin Touhey, was dying from lung cancer, Patrick promised him he'd continue his passionate work of athletic coaching. With Elite Performance Touhey, Patrick mentors both coaches and players to tap into their hearts and passions, pursue the spirit of team sports, and become the best version of themselves. Elite Performance Touhey emphasizes intrinsic elements rather than extrinsic metrics that sports often prioritize, such as hours of work, scholarships, and individual statistics. By teaching the value of service, leadership, and team connection, Patrick and Elite Performance Touhey help athletes to overcome the common selfish and self-absorbed mindset and use the athletic experience toward their development as people and potential leaders. Patrick has played an integral part in coaching multiple teams to win state championships and reach their highest potential. Fall in love with basketball again this February with our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market. Be sure to check out their new Dr. Dish facility model with advanced analytics. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoop Heads podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoop Heads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
Hi, this is Mijairo Ducano from Gannon Baker Basketball, and you're listening to the Hoop Heads podcast.
If you're looking to improve your coaching, please consider joining the Hoop Heads Mentorship Program. We believe that having a mentor is the best way to maximize your potential and become a transformational coach. By matching you up with one of our experienced mentors, you'll develop a one-on-one relationship that will help your coaching, your team, your program, and your mindset. The Hoop Heads Mentorship Program delivers mentoring services to basketball coaches at all levels through our team of experienced head coaches. Find out more at hoopheadspod.com or shoot me an email directly, mike@hoopheadspod.com. Follow us on social media at hoopheadspod on Twitter and Instagram, and be sure to check out the Hoop Heads Podcast Network for more great basketball content. Prepare like the pros with the all-new Fast Draw and Fast Scout. Fast Draw has been the #1 play diagramming software for coaches for years. You'll quickly see why Fast Model Sports has the most compelling and intuitive basketball software out there. For a limited time, Fast Model is offering Hoop Heads listeners 15% off Fast Draw and Fast Scout. Just use the code HHP15 at checkout to grab your discount, and you'll be on your way to more efficient game prep and improved communication with your team. Fast Model also has new coaching content every week on its blog, plus play and drill diagrams on its Playbank. Check out the links in the show notes for more. Fast Model Sports is the best in basketball. Have your notebook ready as you listen to this episode with Patrick Touhey, author of the new book, Create Forever Teammates. Hello, and welcome to the Hoop Heads podcast. It's Mike Linsling here with my co-host, Jason Sunkle. And tonight we are pleased to welcome to the podcast the author of the new book, Create Forever Teammates, Patrick Touhey. Patrick, welcome to the Hoop Heads pod.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it. And really am very grateful for the opportunity to be with you and your audience. Excited about it.
Absolutely. We are excited as well. Want to thank you for taking the time. Let's start by just letting people know what the book's all about, kind of the why behind it, and just give us the elevator pitch for the book and why someone would want to read and learn from some of your experiences and the experiences of your brother, who I know was a big influence on the book.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So basically, from my own experience as an athlete, my involvement in coaching and doing the work that I do with many athletic teams across the country, there were some things I was noticing that were observations that were concerning to me, or at least things that I felt needed to be addressed in order to change the experience that athletes were experiencing while they were learning how to play the sport they're playing, the environment that they were learning it in, and the overall coaching experience based on some of the things that were being done by coaches. And I felt very compelled to introduce some lessons and tenets around building an experience that was more meaningful when it comes to relationships and connections between teammates, based on these challenges that I observed and from what kids were experiencing. I felt as though if we could somehow find a way to integrate these lessons and tenets, the connections and relationships would be so strong that the overall experience itself, Mike, would be so much more powerful for those athletes. It would help develop an ability to be great leaders, once they leave the athletic environment. It would also equip them to be really great communicators and influencers in respect to getting the best out of others in what their full potential is, and this ability to serve in a way that would be identified as difference makers. So I put this book together to try to address that, and I'm really happy with what I've put together. And I do believe that it would make a very significant difference to any program if these tenets and lessons were integrated, taught, and became part of the program.
I had an opportunity to read the book over the course of 2 days. So I started it yesterday and finished it today. You and I jumped on a phone call earlier this week and talked through some of the things that you felt were important that I should look for as I was reading the book. And we just hashed out some of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight. And certainly as we were talking, a lot of the themes that have come through on the Hoopheads pod are themes that you and I talked about in our pre-pod call. And there's certainly things that you put into the book, and there are topics and issues that are very near and dear to my heart in terms of what I think we need to do to be able to make sports better for everybody involved, for the players, for coaches, for parents. And when I read the book, there were a couple things that really jumped out at me that we're going to talk about tonight. And one of the first things that you start with is sort of the difference between the way you grew up back in the day versus the way that kids grow up today, where they used to have a lot more free play. They used to have a lot more autonomy. They used to have to figure things out on their own. Today, things just aren't the same. We parent differently. Society as itself is different. And as a result of that, kids typically participate in sports with an adult around to help them figure things out, to mitigate problems. Whereas when you and I were growing up, you had to figure those things out on your own. So let's start there, where there's obviously positives to the system today, and we can talk about those as well. But let's talk a little bit about why you feel that missing out on that free play that you and I got to participate in and enjoyed so much, how has that impacted the youth sports landscape in your mind in a negative way?
Yeah. And you're right, Mike. There are some positive, obviously some things about it, but where I see it to be a challenge and a struggle is it's just human nature when there's an overindulgence of adult activity in the learning experience for the athlete. There's going to be this adult perspective on what success looks like. And as an adult, we tend to put a seriousness into the matter that for kids at very young ages, and almost starting from the beginning, Mike, they begin to internalize what is involved in the sport and what's expected of them, from an adult perspective, from an adult mindset. And so when I talk about this independent free play, what saddens me and what I see is what we were gifted with in prior generations and what we really enjoyed about playing athletics and sports is we were able to attach our own, if I could put it in this way, our own heart and soul in an intrinsic connection to what we were doing because it was truly independent. And it was this idea of not only was it involving very competitive play, but there was also this fun play that was part of it. And so what would evolve for us is over time, we would have this connection to the sport that was full of joy. And because it was full of joy, we wanted to do more of it. And because we wanted to do more of it, it meant that we were going to get better at our skills, not only in how we execute the fundamentals and skill sets of the game, but how we're developing our social skills, how we're developing how we can disagree with someone, yet find a way to resolve it, how we can, in the middle of competition, have a total different perspective about how we felt the play went or whether it was out of bounds or in bounds or all these things that we independently had this connection to the game that allowed us to identify with it in a way that not only was our own connection, but it truly was our own spirit of fun that we had. And so the players that I talked to today, Mike, and the players that I worked with today who do not have that opportunity really see the game in a totally different way in what they're being asked to focus on. And it's very much not only an individualized experience, but it very much is about how am I getting improvement in a way that I get validation and acceptance from the adults that are interjected into the experience because they're weighing my every move. They're measuring my every skill set. They're teaching me everything I need to know in respect to how to deal with failure. And that failure has a lot of pressure tied to it when it's coming from an adult's perspective. And so it gets them kind of in this place where there's a lot of pressure around playing the sport, and there's a lot of work around playing the sport. And listen, I love the beauty of improving. I love the beauty of athletes getting to mastery in respect to what they do. But there are two different ways to go about that. And all I'm saying is because of this adult intervention and this lack of independent play that has a true spirit to it, this experience they're going through gives them very little opportunity or chance to look at it as joy and play because it's very much work-like.
I love that analogy of having a youth player look at playing sports as work. And it's not one that I think people think of very often, but if you really were to look at it from the outside, let's say a person who wasn't involved in sports, and you look at, okay, well, what does this 11-year-old kid do as a basketball player? So Monday they go to a speed, strength, agility training program for an hour and a half, and then they go work with their trainer for an hour. Then the next day they have practice supervised by a coach and assistant, and dad is sitting on the sideline watching practice. And then they have tournaments on the weekend with officials and people in the stands, and everybody's always watching them. And there's just all these things that when are they getting an opportunity to just play for fun? And it's easy to see where it could be classified very simply as work. And from a perspective of an 11-year-old, you can see where it could certainly be perceived as work. I think back to my own experiences, and I don't know exactly how they relate to the experiences that you had, but I think they're fairly similar in that I was a kid who I loved to work at the game. I loved to try to get better, but I was a rare kid who liked that part of it. In addition to the playing, most kids enjoyed the playing. Hey, we're going to go and play 2-on-2 in the driveway, or we're going to go up to the courts and play basketball, or we're going to meet in the yard and play some backyard football, or we're going to play a game of sandlot baseball. And we did that not because we wanted to get better at football or we wanted to get better at baseball or basketball. We did it because it was fun. And now I think kids get this message that everything that they do has to be towards getting better, towards some end goal, whatever that is. And I think we do, as you said, lose the fun. So I think one of the things that I always think about when it comes to this issue is, yes, we're missing this, but how do we, as coaches, how do we bring this piece of it back, even though it's never coming back in the sense of no parents are going to open up the door and just say, hey, go hang out in the neighborhood the way our parents did. But how, as a coach or as an adult, how can we try to simulate that environment and give kids more opportunity for free plays? Do you see any way that we can bring that free play back into our youth sporting experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I believe we can. And it's the reason why I wrote the book, and to help coaches and guide them in how they can integrate some of these lessons into their program so that we can bring that kind of atmosphere, that kind of environment, and that kind of experience for the kids. Because I know this, Mike, it's never going to go back to the way it used to be. The independent free play of kids going to the field and to the courts and to the places that they would even, God, I remember, Mike, when I was a young kid playing, we had these two neighbors, and their houses, their backyards backed up to each other. When you put them together, it was almost the size of a 50-yard football field. And, 20, 30 kids would meet at that field, and we'd pick teams and we'd play competitive football. And we had a lot of fun doing it. And the thing that I want to emphasize, and I'll give you how we can bring it into today. The thing I want to emphasize more than anything, Mike, is when kids are asked to connect to each other without adults, there's an intimacy that occurs that creates that fire and spirit. And when young athletes aren't communicating in that way, and they're not relating to each other in that way, and you can imagine this adult being very much a part of the equation, it wouldn't be too far-fetched for one to say there's a lot of conversations that aren't occurring between those young athletes that would occur if the adults weren't there. There's a lot of things that would be going on besides playing the sport that were fun to do that we aren't going to be able to do because the adults are there. And this is about learning how to do this right now. And this is about this skill and this exercise. And that's why we're here. And that's what we're going to work on. And I just want to stress that kind of interaction, that kind of connection is the spirit that I'm talking about, Mike. And that spirit is where the joy comes from. And so it's very important that we understand that if you were to ask a young athlete at that time, do you really consciously get that you're building this intrinsic joy just by the way you're interacting with each other and having this independent free play? There's probably not one athlete that would say, oh yeah, I very much identify with that. I get that's why we're doing this. And I get that's why we're having so much fun. And that's really where it was all happening. And so I think of athletes that I work with, Mike, who there are some out there, and I know you're aware of this. There are some out there that have a passion and an intrinsic spirit who love the process of getting better. They love the practices. They love the games. They love everything about it. What is it about those athletes today that gives them that kind of experience around having to become a better athlete and a better player? Well, they have a different connection to the sport. They have a real love for it. And so why they're engaged in all that work, Mike, internally for them, it's fun. It's not work. And so when people say, well, why can't everybody be like that? Why can't everybody love the process like that player does and have the same kind of self-drive and passion that that player plays? Well, Mike, that's an exception. They're very much an exception. And they truly have a different connection of spirit to playing that allows them to do all that and basically have fun doing it. There are many, many, many other kids and athletes that don't have that kind of connection. So we have to not only be concerned about it's empty from getting it based on the environment and the structure that they're playing in. How do we bring it in with intention? And when you look at building an intrinsic connection, an intrinsic joy to participating, and even in the process, it truly is all about how do I take that connection that these young kids were having that they weren't conscious of that made it so much fun? What were some of those things that were involved? Well, there were things like compassion. There was things like empathy. There was things like vulnerability. There was things like wanting something better for your friend. In other words, this connection to serving others and to help others become better at who they were. There wasn't this selfishness and self-centeredness and individualism that we're seeing a lot of today. And I could go on and on about how that's happening. But and so we have to bring these ideas of love. Like we really got to bring love into our program with some intention and with some purpose. I mean, what's that all about? I mean, how do I even begin to go about doing that? Well, I mean, the book tells you some ways in which we can bring that particular experience into playing the game and learning how to play it and becoming better skilled at it. But why do we have to do it with intention? And when was love ever really something that in any program that we had to bother with? Well, it's if it doesn't happen today, Mike, if it doesn't get brought into the experience, they're not learning it along the way. So when I talk about all those things that I've just identified, Mike, those are intrinsic exercises that when laid out in a practical way, Mike. So in this book, what I do is I put together very practical lessons that wouldn't be too difficult for any program if they followed the instruction and went through the exercise. All of a sudden, they're bringing in this kind of environment, this kind of atmosphere that is also integrated in everything else that we do, and that's required to become the best of who we can at whatever sport we're playing. And what you're going to see, Mike, when that happens, and this is what happens time and time again as I bring these lessons and tenets into any program, in a relatively short period of time, all of a sudden the athletes have an emotional change and an emotional energy shift around what other reasons they're playing the sport. And when they all of a sudden become awakened to the idea that there's a bigger picture going on, that there's a bigger purpose being served, that the beauty of being part of something bigger than yourself is this true connection and relationship in which you are really centered around one of my biggest purposes here is to help my brother or my sister succeed and to really care about who they are as a person, not just how many points they're going to score, not just how many rebounds they're going to get or how many steals they're going to get. I'd like my teammate to know that I care about who they're developing as a person, how I can contribute towards making that happen and how they can do the same for me. And then all of a sudden we're connecting at a way, Mike, that is so much different than when I hear teams and I work with teams around saying, this is a brotherhood or this is a sisterhood or we're best friends. But when you get down to the depth of it, Mike, it's very surfacey. And the reason why it's very surfacey is because of how they're learning how to play it, how they're learning to position themselves around really. And again, I don't want to be over dramatic, but there's this overlying atmosphere of how do I get ahead? how do I get an advantage? How do I get noticed? How do I get that opportunity to maybe play at the next level? And I'm being trained that way in specialization and private lessons and AAU travel and a whole bunch of different dynamics, Mike, that are, and I'm not saying it's done maliciously. Please, it's the environment and the culture that we've established. So I'm not necessarily blaming anybody or saying anyone should feel, ashamed or bad about it. It's just evolved to this thing that we've produced, and we've gotten lost in the process. And so when you take all that and you have this athlete, can you imagine you have this athlete being plugged into when they're finally part of a team? And that usually happens at the high school level, right? Some of them play on different travel teams. They're very connected to those teams. They have a lot of games with those teams. They have a different purpose in what they're about, in what they're trying to accomplish with those teams. And all of a sudden, those kids walk into a high school environment where you have 4 or 5 other kids that don't play travel ball. They're not in that same way of learning. And somehow, as a head coach, you've got to meld that, and you have to begin to try to say, okay, how do I in some ways undo all this and bring this kind of passion and purpose into the program, so that all the players can gain this kind of meaningful connection. And when you do that, Mike, better than anyone else, being involved in sports yourself, these players that embrace these teachings that I'm talking about, that truly work really hard, knowing that they're human, to be as selfless, trusting, feeling a sense of inclusion, operating in integrity, learning how to be leaders. They run through brick walls for each other, Mike. And they love doing it. Here's the thing, because it's not rocket scientists, right? If I'm coaching a program, the first thing I would say to myself, Mike, is how do I get my kids to love this? Not preach it, not lecture it, not force my will upon it, so that they will get passionate, so that they will get purposeful, so that they will get energized. That's draining. I talk to so many coaches who feel so drained. Why is there a percentage of players that have such apathy about what they're doing? Why do I have to work so hard to get them to work hard in practice? What is this all about? Well, if you could take a step back and say, where are they coming from? What are they experiencing it? How is it different than what I experienced it? Because I can't draw comparisons. I can draw some, but I can't draw a lot of comparisons about trying to help these young players truly find their own spirit by my own experience. I've got to come where they're at today. But if I can somehow integrate love into my program, I know this, and it's not complicated. When you love doing something, you want to do it a lot more. And that comes from them. All of a sudden, I don't have to work so hard as a coach to get them to find passion and purpose, to get them to find their meaning of why they're doing all this. See, Mike, the extrinsic focus, the extrinsic laser focus we have as parents and even as coaches, and this laser focus that we've gotten to say winning is the only thing that matters, has dominated the skill development, because that's how you win. You become the best skilled at who you can, and you can accomplish it that way. You can accomplish it that way. But we have to spend all our time on execution, on strategy, on detail. I don't have time to build the intrinsic. I know you didn't get it as a lad, as a young player, but I have time for that. We got to win. I really can't spend a lot of time on that. And so it's this fear that gets in the way for us, Mike. It's this fear that if we if we spend some time on the intrinsic development so that our players just like are so connected to each other that they will run into a brick wall for each other and are loving the process. We get so hung up in the fear that that's going to not prepare us in the way that we need to be prepared to win, because there's too much work that needs to be done. And as a result, it backfires, Mike. And I do believe it's the reason why. It's not the only reason, Mike, but I do believe that it contributes to the decrease in participation in sports. I mean, I was down in South Carolina this summer, and there was a sign at the church buildings and at the YMCA that said, please, and I mean please in capital letters, we need youth coaches and officials. And I thought to myself, why is that? You don't have to look too hard when I travel around the country and I see the lack of participation. And I'm talking about programs that even win. And what goes through my mind when I see a sign like that is, and we need to wake up, Mike. We need to wake up, because I think there are great coaches, great potential coaches out there that are young coaches who are saying, I'm not going to get into that profession. I'm not going to put up with all that craziness. There's no way. You can pay me enough as a high school coach or a junior high coach or a volunteer youth coach. And officials saying the same. Am I going to go officiate a game with the risk of some parent coming out of the stands and punching me in the face? I'm not going to do that. No way. And if we don't think that's happening, Mike, we're fooling ourselves. We're sticking our head in the sand. And I'm not being over dramatic. I know many of us and probably a lot of people who are listening tonight are saying, I can give you the exact opposite things that are happening. And I would agree with that. I'm not disagreeing that what I'm speaking of exists out there, Mike, but it's in a much smaller percentage in population if we really don't do something about it. And these lessons in this book, they work. Why do I know they work? Because I execute them in the programs that I work with across the country. And I will tell you that any coach you talk to who would give you some insight on where their programs were at, whether they're a winning program or losing program, where their program was at before the work was done, and they took the risk of saying, as scary as this is, I'm gonna dedicate 25% of my practice over this course of the year and give it to classroom work around intrinsic development that allows connections and relationships to happen at a deeper level, so there can be so much more joy in the process. And these players can not only know that they're going out there to achieve this goal of winning, but they're doing it with someone that they love very much while they're in the process of doing it. And they would tell you that fast forward to where they're at today, and these kids love being with each other. Can I share a quick story with you that illustrates it even better, Mike?
Absolutely. Please.
Yeah. So my brother Kevin taught me this work many, many years ago, and I was the head coach. And I'll be very honest. I was caught up in the fear of not winning, and I was one of those coaches who was very focused on the extrinsic development. And there were a lot of reasons. So I do not sit here in judgment of any of this. I sit here speaking of a person who was very much engaged in what we're teaching culturally and the system in which we're learning. So I had a bunch of freshmen who were my most skilled players, believe it or not, in the system. So this was a high school head job. And I brought up 8 of those freshmen, and 4 of them started for me. Now, what I knew was this, Mike, that We weren't going to win a lot of games. We just didn't have the physicality to do it, and we didn't have the mental maturity to do it. So I did it at a risk, knowing that, okay, Patrick, even though they're your most skilled players, will you break their confidence because you're setting them up to fail? And how would we address that and take care of that while we were going along in the season? And I did all of these lessons that year with these young athletes. And the way we did it, Mike, was once a week, we would go into the classroom and we would bring up one of these lessons, and we would have, very heartfelt, honest, and sometimes very discomforting discussions around what they were experiencing in respect to failing, because they were failing a lot. Okay. And so here's what I would say to you. Here we are 3/4 of the way in the season, and these kids absolutely would truly do anything for each other based on this development. So we're 3/4 of the way into the season, and we haven't won a game yet, Mike. We haven't won a game yet. And if you came into my gym and you sat down and you just observed our practice without having any idea that we had not won a game, you would have come up to me after our practice and say, Coach, you must be having one hell of a season. I mean, the way your kids are getting after it out there, the way they're pushing each other, the way that they're treating each other. Sorry, Mike, hate to disappoint you, but we haven't won a game yet. What the hell are they playing for? What's the play for? Coach, how do you get them so passionate? Well, they're connected to each other for a different purpose. So they love each other. 0-20 going into the state tournament, because in Michigan, everybody makes the state tournament. And we end up, because of our record, playing the number 2 seed in the state. And we lost by 35, 38 points. And I go into the locker room afterwards, and these players are all crying. And I say to them, why so emotional? And they say, Coach, we don't want this to be over. We want to go to practice tomorrow. So fast forward, Mike, it's a beautiful story. Fast forward that summer, I didn't have to call any of them to come to the gym. I didn't have to beg any of them to go do some weightlifting. They couldn't wait to get back to with each other. They couldn't wait to play in tournaments. Sophomores, what's going to happen? It's the biggest turnaround in school history. They won 15 games the following year as sophomores and made it to the district finals of the state tournament. And they didn't love each other any less or more. It wasn't about any of those things. It was about competing with someone you care for at a deep level. And the joy, the escalated joy when you win, and the sorrow when you lose, and the disappointment, and how you console each other. It's a big difference, Mike. True story. True story.
It's a powerful story. That's a powerful story for sure.
Yeah.
But
that's how we bring it back.
When I hear you tell that story, and when I go through and I look at the book in its totality, one of the things that struck me, and it was a word that you used, is the need for a coach to be intentional with what they do. And the things that you're describing, the mini workshops that you detail in the book, are things that a coach has to want to do. A coach has to be conscious of, I'm going to do these things, and figure out, how do I incorporate that into my program? How does that become a part of my program? How is it not just an add-on? How is it not just something that I do when I have an extra 5 minutes here, or I'm not really blocking out time in my schedule? So I think that need to be intentional is really, really important. And then I think the other thing that, as I looked at it And I started thinking about, okay, what would this look like in programs that I've been a part of? What would this look like? How would we go about doing this? And I think one of the things that struck me over and over and over again, and you kept coming back to it throughout the book, is the need for the coach to be equally as open, vulnerable, willing to share, putting themselves out there as you expect your players to be, because you can't expect the players to open themselves up and be vulnerable and share things about themselves if you as the coach are not willing to do that. So if you could maybe address just how important it is for the coach to take the lead, to be the example setter, especially early in the process where players may not be as willing to share. Once you get this going, you're going to get more players that are willing to go through the process of talking to each other, of determining what it is about their teammates that they didn't know before, what makes them special, how do we connect. But initially, that process can be difficult because the players don't yet trust that it's a safe environment. So just talk about how important it is for a coach to sort of open up the floor and be vulnerable to get the ball rolling so that these things can happen.
Yeah. So and you bring up the word trust, and it's one of the biggest deficits that exists in many programs is this lack of trust. And not only lack of trust between the players, but lack of trust with the coach and the players. And the most powerful antidote to addressing teams that lack trust is vulnerability. And as a coach, it takes this understanding that there's a balance, and it's okay. There's a balance between who I am as their coach and leader and who I am as a human being. That I have as a coach have this beautiful opportunity, if I'm willing to put it out there. And trust me, Mike, these young players want this so badly. So it doesn't take a lot. But if I'm a coach and I'm willing to say, I have this beautiful gift of experience, I have this beautiful gift of life's celebrations and life's hardships and difficulties. And if I'm willing to show some humanness in this balance between, who I am as a leader, who I am as a coach, and at the same time coming to their level, that if I'm willing to put it out there and share it, all of a sudden there's these walls that start coming down. This armor that we put up to protect ourselves, because we're supposed to be strong. We're not supposed to be weak. We're not supposed to be flawed. We're supposed to be perfect. We're not supposed to have mental challenges. We're supposed to have it all together. And yet we all sit in that room, whether we're a player and a coach, and we pretend. We might not be doing it consciously, Mike, but we pretend like we have it all together. And we pretend that things shouldn't be the way they are. And so if a coach is willing to walk into that room and start off a session by saying, men or ladies, one of the most important factors for us to be able to have any kind of excellence and success, and to prepare you as athletes and to prepare you for life, we have to learn how to trust. And I know from my experience and background as your coach, I know this might be a little bit uncomfortable, but I will tell you that I do know that vulnerability, that this willing, how about this word, Mike? This willingness as a coach to be intimate, which Kevin would always say and break it down to into me see, intimacy, into me see. And here I am, young men and young women. And I'm willing to put myself out there. And I'm willing to share something with you that's personal. And to the depth that you want to do that is totally up to you.
One of the things go ahead.
And then all of a sudden what happens in that instant, Mike, is the players begin to have a different perspective of who you are. And they say, hold on, if coach is willing to do that, maybe it's okay for me to do that. Maybe it's okay for me to put something out there that is less than perfect, and that some may judge as being awful and some may judge as being terrible. But coach is opening up the door. He's opening, even if it's ever so slightly, the window's opening up. Coach is showing us a part of himself that not many coaches are willing to do. But how about this, Mike? Whether we back to that little independent free play, if I were to ask, and I know for a fact, the teams that I work with today, that do you know that this exercise is the same feeling and the same experience that those young kids who had independent free play were developing intrinsically? This same connection you're feeling, this same inner deep connection. By me sharing my vulnerability and you sizing that up as coach is showing me a different side of himself, I feel like maybe I can put something out there, something real. This coach is saying to me, young man and young lady, see, I love you as a person. I know you can shoot the hell out of the basketball. And I know you're a fierce rebounder. And I know you play tenacious defense. See, young people see right through coaches who are trying to get everything they can out of somebody for their own personal gain, accolades, rewards. They know it, Mike. They're very intuitive. But you get a coach that's saying, no, see, I want to know you. I want to know you much deeper than that. And my purpose here for you is to help you grow as a young person, not only to be your best basketball player or football player or whatever. And so what I'm trying to connect the dots here with, Mike, is okay, Patrick, how do you bring that experience in here? Well, that's what's happening. That's what's happening. We're connecting at an intrinsic level through an exercise that was the same connection those little kids had in prior generations in independent free play.
You talk about a phrase that I had never really heard before, but when I read it, it really crystallized with me because we had actually just talked to another person who had mentioned this same idea, but in a slightly different way. So I'm curious as to how this resonates with you. And that is that a lot of the, I don't know if issues is the right word, but a lot of the things that go on with us as individuals, whether we're athletes, whether we're parents, whether we're coaches, is this fear of failure. If I'm an athlete, I fear not living up to my own expectations or my expectations of an outside force, whether that's my parents, whether that's a coach. If I'm a parent, I have this fear of I'm not keeping up with the people around me. Somebody else's, my neighbor's son or daughter is a star athlete and my kid's just out there running around. How come I don't have a star athlete? And if I'm a coach, obviously I want to have success. I want to be able to point to my one-loss record. I want to be able to be known as, hey, that guy or that girl that person can really coach. They're a winner. But yet we all suffer from this fear of failure. And in the book, you say that we should teach kids to have their first response to failure be curiosity and be, well, I just failed. Why did that happen? Why did I miss this shot? Why did I not do X, Y, or Z? Why did we not win this game? And so often, as you said earlier, when we're sitting there, we tend to look outward to find somebody to blame for something that goes wrong. And we're not very good at being honest with ourselves about why we failed. And if we create this situation where, hey, things didn't go well, I'm curious why. Let me dig into figuring out what I can do differently or how I can approach it. And we talked to Mark Hendrickson on the podcast about a week and a half ago, and his episode just went up last week. And in that, Mark is one of 12 people to have ever played in the NBA and in Major League Baseball. And one of the things that he said to me, which as soon as I read that statement from you, that curiosity should be your response to failure, he said in his experience, one of the things that sets professional athletes apart is their ability to A, be brutally honest with themselves, and then B, the ability to quickly make adjustments to what they're doing in order to correct whatever failure it was that they came in contact with. So it's not a matter of like the professional athlete doesn't delude themselves into thinking, hey, I'm doing a great job, when really they know that there was some flaw in their performance that they needed to fix. And their ability to quickly, A, be honest with themselves and then diagnose that and make a change. He felt like that was something that he saw much more often as a professional athlete than he saw when he was a high school player or a college player or whatever it might be. And I just thought that those two statements are somewhat related. So just tell us a little bit about how or why you believe that teaching kids to be curious about why they failed, why is that a good way to approach looking at failure for any athlete, any person for that matter?
See, Mike, this is one of the most severe damaging things that we're doing with our young athletes when it comes to how they're experiencing failure and adversity. And it's also a major contributor, Mike, as to why many programs struggle with having strong leaders on their team. And I'll tie the two together. So in the culture that we're in today, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to see or imagine that as adults, there are many cases where we protect our children from feeling disappointment. We protect our children from feeling as though they failed. We protect our children by handling very discomforting conversations. We protect our children by maybe not having, and I know some won't like hearing me say this, but having the highest level of integrity that their son or daughter would need to execute to pay the consequences for their actions. Subliminally, what's occurring and what maybe we don't understand is, because you don't want me to feel disappointment, because you don't want me to feel the emotions that come with failure, because you're stepping in and handling very discomforting conflict and conversations, all of that must be bad. There's something wrong with me if I experience those things. They're not acceptable. That's what you're teaching me, that it's a bad thing. How very sad. How very sad. So when they do fail, it's a different depth of how they're interpreting it. When they are being confronted with conflict and when they are being told what they need to improve upon in a way that might be firm, because sometimes that's necessary, Mike. They have a hard time handling it. Once again, when we were in independent free play and not all these adults were around doing all this for us, guess who had to figure those things out, Mike? Guess who had to work for those things, Mike? Guess who had to develop the skill set to be able to do those things? And so when I talk to these athletes about what their internal dialogue is when they experience failure or not doing it just right or all of these other things, they are so brutally hard on themselves in the internal dialogue that goes on. You know, isn't it interesting? I know when I went to go play, and I was in, and I want to stress this, Mike, because I think it's very important. I'm not talking about, and I even hate putting it this way because I don't want to make judgment on this either, but I want everyone to know that I'm not talking about we all need to sit around the campfire and have, a kumbaya session. So these things that I teach and these things that I implement are necessary around becoming a fierce competitor and loving to compete and pursuing. I love Coach K when he talks about our goal every night is to win, but our destiny is to become the best possible version of ourselves. And so when I was on that playground playing and I failed, I didn't have a lot of intense attention to what mistake I just made or what I just failed at. I internalized it as, okay, that didn't go real well. What can I do next? Or maybe I need to do it a different way. But I didn't have this intense focus on making sure that failure never happened again, because failure isn't acceptable. It's bad to fail. And so these kids have to take that on. Mike, can you imagine having that kind of attention from everyone and protecting yourself? And when you do succeed and when you do get mastery and when you do finally achieve at a level you're very happy to get to, a lot of the experience of that achievement is failing through fear, not through curiosity. See, when you get past failure, when fear is your primary motivator, I love when kids say to me, hey, I love being angry and I love being afraid because that pushes me. I get so angry. I mean, that pushes me. That's great. But it also drains you. And when you make it, and when you finally make it, Mike, you take a look back and it feels so empty because there was so much pressure and fear to the achievements. There wasn't a lot of joy going on. Yeah, I made it. Is this all there is? How many times have you heard that, Mike? I've heard it too many times when a kid, is this all there is to it? Is this all there is? So we need to get back to this and we need to teach him this lesson. And I talk about self-compassion in my book is the antidote to addressing failure because it allows for curiosity. In other words, what we have to start teaching our athletes is this: thank failure, thank it, be grateful for it. Because guess what? It's time to grow and learn, man. I want to tell you that successes are beautiful. And in some cases it came to you very easy. There were other cases where it didn't come to you so easy, but yet you achieved it. But what I want you to know, son or daughter or young player, is failure is failure is the catalyst to mastery. Thank it. Thank it. Get excited about it. Be curious. I don't want you to play it safe. Now, there are guardrails, right? In the discipline of the game, there are guardrails. So I'm not talking about being sloppy. I'm not talking about being reckless. That's not what I'm getting at. Those have their reasonings and they have their very meaningful purpose. But what I'm talking about is we need to shift through a sense of curiosity and through a sense of embracing failure as this wonderful opportunity to be this catalyst to meet mastery. Because, right, Mike, if you're not pushing yourself, if you're playing it safe, you're not reaching your best self in any way, shape, or form. Whether you're playing basketball, whether you're the head of a podcast, whether you're the CEO of a company. So go out there and fail in that pursuit, because that tells me you're growing. That tells me that you're doing the hard stuff. And I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud that you're willing to put yourself out there. Now let's work on it. Let's get curious about it and let's work on it, but let's have some fun while we're doing it. And then all of a sudden, Mike, this sabotaging, self-destructive dialogue that occurs with these athletes gets shifted. And how about this one? This is what I love about this work that I do. When you go out and pursue who you want to be in your career with this in your toolbox, trust me, you're going to be a difference maker. There's going to be people that are going to be drawn to you. You are going to be a leader that molds and shapes people who can't get enough of you. This is the gratitude part that I talk about in my book too, Mike. We have to, I talk about selling programs because this idea of putting, in the old days, you put tryouts up on the billboard in the hallway, tryouts are at 3:00 and 140 kids showed up. Those days are gone. We have too much competition, like it or not. We have too much competition to draw players to the game. And as coaches, we better start thinking of it. I say this all the time, Mike, and I think it's so important. I have to be present in today. I have to be in their shoes. I have to be where they're at. And then I start from there. And how do I draw conclusions and plans and actions to get some movement, to get some shift, to get some attraction to my program? What do I have to do? And I think it seems simple, and maybe it is simple, but it's powerful, is why should a player feel gratitude for being on a team? Maybe I need to talk about that. Maybe I need to make them aware of that. Maybe I need to bring that to their conscience, because we're not talking about it very much along the way. There's other things we're making more important, like how am I going to get ahead? How am I going to make it? How am I going to get the scholarship? We're not talking about those things that they need to be very grateful for, such as this unbelievable, valuable lesson about how to handle failure. I often say, Mike, whether it's an orange basketball with black stripes, a brown football with threads, threading to hold it together, or a yellow tennis ball, you can use whatever you want to make the analogy. But how beautiful is it that thing? And I think the pioneers and the forefathers that developed sports, that instrument has the ability to change your life and prepare your life and bring you relationships that you're going to be in your entire life. You want some gratitude? I learned how to be in a relationship through sports because we paid attention to it. We paid attention to who we were being. These coaches I played for, who we were being, why we were winning mattered. How we were treating each other, why we were winning mattered. How we were being selfless and thinking the other player first, that when we were in that locker room and we left to go play the game, we were not only focused on what we needed to bring individually, but we were just as focused, if not more so focused, on how I help my teammate succeed. Thank you, orange ball. Thank you, brown ball, for giving me this valuable gift of being in a relationship. Because now I can go out and do my thing and know what it means to be in a relationship, whether it be my future partner, whether it be my coworkers, whether I be the leader of a group in a company. Is there any gratitude for that, Mike? Are any of our players connected to that, Mike? Sorry, I keep saying your name. It's just a habit I have. But do they? Do they have any idea of that special gift? Are we talking to them about it? I'm sorry that I went on.
No, I don't think we are. I don't think we're talking about that. I don't think that we as coaches often take the time to break down and help our players to understand all of the things that they should be grateful for. I think it's hard for coaches to do for the same reason it's hard for them to carve out time to do some of the things that you've been talking about and things that we talk about on the podcast, to be able to get to know their players better on and off the floor, to get to know them as people, to invest in them as people. That stuff is hard to do because it takes time. B, it's hard to do because you have to open up yourself in order to get them to open up. And many of us find that to be extremely challenging and difficult. And not that we don't want to do it, but oftentimes we don't even do it in our personal lives, probably as much as we should. And so
point.
then, right. And then, so then to go and do that in front of our team, it just doesn't seem like it's something that can be comfortable. And I know that it's something, again, that you have to do as a coach. It's something that it's been shown over and over again that if you have a more connected team, what do coaches always say? I'm looking for a team that has chemistry, a team that's fun to coach, a team that gets along with one another. Well, you could sit around and maybe you have a 30-year coaching career and maybe accidentally you get that once, right? That you just have a group of kids that for whatever reason, they kind of come together on their own. It all coalesces and you've got that magical team. But what your book talks about and what you've been sharing with us tonight is that you can make that happen and help facilitate that, where you can get something like that every single season. And you can get that on a team where your results on the scoreboard are lots and lots of wins. And you can get that same feeling when the results on the scoreboard are lots and lots of losses. And ultimately, when you think about your own athletic experience, or when I think about my athletic experience, there are certainly some wins and losses that we remember, but mostly what we remember is the people. We remember the relationships with teammates. We remember the relationships with coaches. We remember the bus rides. We remember the team meals. We remember hanging out in the locker room. Like, those are the stories that get told over and over and over again. Sure, every once in a while there's a memorable play or a memorable game that somebody will remember, but for the most part, you're remembering the people. And if you can give your players, and let's face it, yourself, right? As a coach, you want your own experience to be better. Wouldn't it be better to spend time every single day with 12 kids or 15 kids or however many kids you have on your team, where you know them, as you said, the word intimately, where you know everything about them and you truly care about them, not just in the moment while they're on the practice floor, but you care about them everywhere they go. And isn't that really what we're looking for? And you talked a little bit about how the ball can do so many amazing things. And I know there's a high school coach in Arkansas who's been a real great friend to the podcast and was one of our first guests, Greg White. And Greg always says there's magic in the ball. And, and it's true. And that's exactly what he was getting at, is that the ability as a coach to utilize that ball, to have an impact on the players that are in front of you, to get to use something that you love as a coach, to be able to use that as a tool to be able to have an impact on young people's lives. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And I think that gratitude piece, one of the things that I started doing at my youth basketball camps is, and this is a speech that I give all the time about being a good sport. And probably 4 or 5 years ago, I added a little piece to it that hadn't been a part of it in the first 15 years, and talking about how we need to be good sports with our opponents. But I also talked about, not only do we have to be good sports with them, we have to be thankful that we have somebody to play against. Imagine if I said, okay, your team, Patrick, is going to go over here and you're going to play against no one. All right, good luck. Have some fun. And too often we look at, and we forget to be thankful, right? That we have somebody to play against. Or you think about yourself as an athlete, right? Like, how fun is it to play? Let's say you're a basketball player, a tennis player, whatever. How fun is it to play against someone who's a lot worse than you? And we've all played games where you're way better than your opponent. Those games aren't that much fun. The games that are fun are the games where somebody's there to push you, to challenge you. And do you lose those games sometimes? Sure. But if we see our opponent as the enemy, as we see him as a roadblock, instead of being thankful, look, that's not to say I'm as competitive as the next guy. Like, I'm going to do everything I can to try to beat you when we step in between the lines, but I'm also thankful that you're there. And I think if you can humanize it for people, for your kids, for your players, I think it just makes things all the better. And really it comes down to what you said multiple times is you have to be intentional about these things. You have to be vulnerable. You have to be open. You have to tell the truth, and you have to get kids to understand and believe in who you are, not just as a coach, but as a person. What kind of person is coach? Does coach tell the truth? If he says or she says this is going to happen, doesn't happen. And as soon as you don't do that, man, you've lost those kids really, really quick. And it's easy to get away from that during the season because you get caught up in the day-to-day and you caught up in, okay, what defense are we going to play to beat this team? Instead of, hey, we need to take our 30 minutes today to do our lesson, as opposed to we need to spend 15 more minutes going over out of bounds play. And it's hard. It's really hard to do.
Yes, it is, Mike. It is. And, the one program I work with out in New Jersey is Shawnee High School football. And Coach Gushu has been coaching for over 40 years, highly successful, legendary coach in Jersey. And he's won 9 state championships. And it's interesting, in 2002, he had hired my brother Kevin to come do this work. And it was a funny story. So he had Kevin in because he had heard about Kevin. And first night that Kevin was going to go address the team, they were walking down the hallway to go to the media center where all the players were waiting. And my brother Kevin turned to Coach Gushu and said, where do you think you're going? He goes, well, I'm going with you to go talk with the team. He goes, no, this is between me and your players. If you really want them to get them where you would like them to be in their relationships, their passion, their purpose, and their meaning, they won't do it while you're in the room. They won't reveal the hard stuff that may need to be talked about. And God bless him. So here's a guy that was very humble and willing to say, okay, that makes sense. I'm going to step out of the way and I'm going to let you have that meeting. And that was the beginning of a 8-year relationship in Kevin teaching these lessons. And if you were to talk to Coach Gushu today, he would say to you that up until 2022, and I'm not saying this is the reason why we do this every year in our program and why it does become 25 to 30% of what we do, because it was hard for me to do that. It was hard for me to trust that. But up until 2022, I had some great football teams that we could never get over the hump of the first or second state playoff game. And something was missing. And all I can tell anybody that's interested about this work is this, that when we implemented this program and the lessons and the tenets and they were taught by both myself and what I learned how to do it, and by having, Kevin and now Patrick in, we've accumulated 9 state championships. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it happened at a time when we truly began to understand how important the intrinsic development is, especially today. And I know that you've heard this, and I've heard it plenty of times, where I've gone to talk to a coach who has won a lot of games and who said to me, I cannot wait for this season to be over.
Yep, we've all heard that.
So from that perspective, you're absolutely right. It's a challenge it is a challenge, but I'm asking coaches to be open to considering it, and once they start, if they're willing to take that risk, once they start, it becomes easier and easier every year. And you don't have to roll the dice to wonder, is this the team that's going to have that chemistry, or is this the team that's going to be able to have those, 2 or 3 leaders that keep it all together and roll the dice. It becomes your culture. It becomes year after year. As your younger players come up through the system, they know this is the culture. They know, that this is what we really enjoy being part of, and everything that it presents to us as players. And this is what Coach Gushu has at Shawnee. I mean, year in and year out, he's never called me and said, man, this is one of those years where I got a tough group that just doesn't have that, it factor as far as chemistry. It's embedded in the culture, and it shows up every year. It really does.
I think another theme that for me ran through the entire book, and as I read it, I kept kind of coming back to this point, and it was that if you're building the kind of program that kids want to be a part of, regardless of the 1-loss record, it comes down to the fact that it has to be about the kids first, and you have to put your own ego aside, your own needs aside, and be willing to do what it takes to create the kind of atmosphere, the kind of program that is going to make kids want to be a part of it. So let's say that I'm a coach and I hear the podcast, I go out, I pick up the book, and yet I'm still a little bit nervous. I'm still a little bit hesitant. I'm still wondering whether or not the investment of time that it's going to take for me to implement some of these things, I'm still not sure it's going to be worth it. What does that conversation look like when you have with them, when somebody is sort of teetering on the fence of, yeah, I kind of believe this stuff, but I'm not 100% sure that I want to invest the time it's going to take to do it. What should I do? How do you what would you say to a coach who's kind of on the fence when it comes to some of the things we've been talking about tonight?
Yeah. So there's a couple things that particular individual could consider. One is, if they reached out to me, that I would be, more than willing to come and work with them initially, hand in hand with the coach or coaches, until such time that they came accustomed to a comfort level of doing similar work independently. So it's this process of coming in and being the mentor and influencer for the coaches until, again, they become more and more comfortable with it. So that's one consideration. And I do that. There's plenty of teams across the country where I go in and do and it runs the gamut, Mike. I mean, some don't want to do much work around it at all, and they'll say, that's why we have you.
Yep.
And so we'll do it that way. There are plenty of others who are afraid, a little unsure, a little uncomfortable, but they want it. There's an inner drive. There's an inner wanting to bring that into the program and to bring that into the experience they have with their players. And so it doesn't take much time for them to get some comfort around it and say to me, okay, I got this. Patrick, thank you so much. This is wonderful. And I'm really glad that you started, and I've known I've always wanted this, and I'm ready to do it independently. And then there are others who are so in tune with this and so open to being vulnerable and sharing and spending the time being the mentor around the players. And this is the thing that's important, is every one of these sessions that take place, and this is happening in the corporate world too. Mike, I'm a senior vice president of a fairly large corporation, and what's being required of us as leaders is the capacity to have what's called emotional intelligence. And so that emotional intelligence requires us to do and learn a skill set around a lot of things that I've laid out in this book, those same skill sets that are brought to an athletic team and a leader as a coach. And you're also beginning to develop leaders who, when they leave, are going to be required to have some sense of being able to show a skill set around emotional leadership. And so I share that only to say to you that there are coaches who are so ready for it that once they read the book, they're off and running. They don't need any guidance from me, any assistance from me, and they truly are ready to go, and they do a great job of it. And if I'm going to be completely honest, there are some who just, no matter what, won't do it. They just won't do it.
You're correct about that. And I think that when I read the book, it just dovetailed with so many themes that have run across our conversation with coaches at all levels of the game, and the direction that coaching has taken from 20 or 30 years ago, where were there coaches that valued relationships and valued some of the things that you talk about in the book 30 years ago? Sure, there were, but there certainly were not as many as there are today. And the coaching profession continues to evolve, the way that we reach our athletes, the way we create the kind of teams and teammates that we want to be a part of. As I said earlier, where you not only want to create a program that is great for the players who are participating, but you as a coach, you want to create the kind of environment that it's fun to go to work every day. You don't want to be that coach saying, man, we're 18-2, but I can't wait for this season to be over. That is a miserable feeling for anybody who's ever had that as a coach. That is not a place that you want to be. So if you're able to implement some of the things that we talked about tonight, the book is really well done. And if you are a coach out there who wants to create the type of program that is going to attract athletes to it, that is going to make those athletes tell their friends and tell their parents and tell their fellow students about how special it is to be a part of this program, then the things that you wrote about, Patrick, in the book, the things that you share, the workshops, the ideas that you put forth, I think are tremendously valuable for any basketball coach out there. The book is titled Create Forever Teammates. And Patrick, before we wrap up, I want to give you one more chance to share where people can find the book, share some social media, email. How can people reach out to you? How can they find out more about what you're doing? And then if there's anything that I missed or we missed in the course of the discussion, a final point maybe that you want to make, you can go ahead and do that. And then I will jump back in and wrap things up.
Thanks so much, Mike. And before we close up, I want to thank you for allowing me to be on your show and having the opportunity to talk about these lessons and the book itself. I'm very grateful. I have a very passionate purpose in respect to this idea that if I can reach out to one coach or to one player who is willing to embrace these wonderful lessons, that it's going to help change a young player's experience around being an athlete. And I'm fully invested in that. I fully believe in it. And if I could say that the pain I hear about in the rooms from the players if there was some way that, whether it be a parent, whether it be a coach, or whoever that influencer is for that young athlete, if they could be in that room, maybe a fly on the wall, and they could hear what's coming from some of these players and what they're experiencing and the pain that they're in, it might have more meaning in its importance and what we need to do to help change some of this. The best way to get access to the book is my website. It's the easiest way, or Amazon, but my website is Elite Performance 2, TOO-E.com. Again, Elite Performance 2, TOO, so that's all one word, -E.com is one way to get to it. You can go to Amazon. You can go to Barnes and Noble. There are also some other book outlets that you would be able to reach them on. If you Googled Create Forever Teammates, it will bring up a number of other places you can go to order and get the book. So I would suggest, if you had any interest, that those